Um, so we have decided to issue warrants in this case today. I have with me copies of the warrants, and after my presentation, we will let you know how you can get copies of the warrants today.
They're charging the officers that are involved in the killing of Rayshard Brooks. Now, this was a killing that took place in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Wendy's when the cops were called in because Brooks was basically asleep in his car. He was inebriated, and the cops were called to basically get him to move that car. Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard Jr., that's the gentleman that you just saw, basically announced the charges against the officers involved in the shooting. Now, former officer Garrett Roth is the one that shot 3 bullets that hit Brooks in the back. 2 of them hit Brooks in the back. 1 exploded in an occupied vehicle nearby the Wendy's parking lot. Basically, one of the shots went awry and hit somebody else's car. Somebody was in that car when that bullet hit the car. Roth faces 11 charges. That's the one who basically killed Brooks. Roth faces 11 charges, felony murder, including 2 counts of aggravated assault related to the bullet he fired that hit an occupied vehicle nearby in the Wendy's parking lot. Bronson, that was the other officer on the scene, faces 3 charges in total, including 2 counts of violation of oath of office. Now, the felony murder charge that Roth faces makes him eligible for the death penalty. David Bronson, the second officer on scene, was placed on administrative leave, and he is going to testify on behalf of the state against Roth. Now, the district attorney makes a few points. Rayshard was calm, cooperative for 41 minutes and 12 seconds of the police interview. He moved the car from blocking the other cars in the parking lot. He allowed a pat-down, meaning the officer knew he didn't have a weapon. He also made the point that the officers never informed Brooks that he was under arrest for DUI, something that's by law you're supposed to do. Also, after Brooks was shot and he was laying on the ground, breathing his last breath, the cops waited for over 2 minutes to provide medical attention. Instead, Roth, after shooting Brooks in the back twice, said, "I got him," walked over and kicked a dying man. Bronson, for his part, found the most productive use of his time and energies in that particular moment was to basically stand on Rayshard's shoulders as he lay there bleeding to death. This is a Me Too moment for policing. I've said this before, I'll say it again. This case, under normal circumstances, would have never been charged. They would have looked at this case and called it a clean shoot, and it would have been one of the over 1,000 murders or killings that basically have result in no charges. Meaning 99% of the killings from 2013 to 2019 resulted in no charges against the officers involved in the shooting. Now, either our cops are magnificent at killing and never killed a man that didn't deserve it, or maybe there's something wrong with those numbers. The catch becomes, unless you are going to fundamentally change the system itself, the 1 or 2 officers that you get is not going to be the thing that resolves this issue. Yes, you can get to the point where you prosecute the hell out of them. You can drop all sorts of jail time. Hell, maybe even put them on death row. But will that stop some of the issues that you have in regards to the way cops flagrantly abuse authority or the way policing is conducted, especially over-policing of minority neighborhoods? Are you going to fundamentally change the system? You find that there's a disproportionate amount of crime, illness, disease, mental illness, lifespan issues, infant mortality rates, and you find that all of those things are basically extensions, especially from the standpoint of probabilities, a disproportionate nature are taking place in poverty. If you got rid of the poverty, would you remove those people from those negative eventualities? Well, the answer becomes yes. I mean, just almost as a by definition. I'm going to go through this case. I'm going to show you the video again, unfortunately. I'm going to show you the best point of view of the video, meaning the best argument that this was a clean kill. And I'm going to use that video, the best argument, to make the point that this is in no way, nor should it be, a clean shoot, and that the prosecution in this case is absolutely right for bringing charges against the officer. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. I'm going to let you hear a little bit more from the prosecutor. I'm going to have to cut this video anyway, so that's fine. But listen to an extension of it when he says, after the shooting has taken place, the behavior of the officers. This also added into their opinion in regards to bringing these charges.
But Mr. Brooks never displayed any aggressive behavior during the 41 minutes and 17 seconds. Now, this is another important consideration that we discovered as we evaluated this case. Once Mr. Brooks was shot, there is an Atlanta policy that requires that the officers have to provide timely medical attention to Mr. Brooks or to anyone who is injured. But after Mr. Brooks was shot, for some period of 2 minutes and 12 seconds, there was no medical attention applied to Mr. Brooks. But when we examined the videotape and in our discussions with witnesses, what we discovered is during the 2 minutes and 12 seconds that Officer Rolfe actually kicked Mr. Brooks while he laid on the ground, while he was there fighting for his life. Secondly, from the videotape, we were able to see that the other officer, Officer Brosnan, actually stood on Mr. Brooks's shoulders while he was there struggling for his life. We were able to conclude that based on the way that these officers conducted themselves while Mr. Brooks was lying there, that the demeanor of the officers immediately after the shooting did not reflect any fear or danger of Mr. Brooks, but their actions really reflected other kinds of emotions.
Now, I don't know what the other kinds of emotions he's talking about, but he said they reflected other kinds of emotions. They were angry, they were amped up, their adrenaline was going, they were pissed off that he was deciding to run and to challenge their authority. Not to mention, they were probably angry and pissed off because of the fight. And so, yeah, other emotions, anger. You may say that they shouldn't act that way, but as human beings, if their training doesn't necessarily go that route for them to immediately give first aid or for them to not to get into this kind of murdering mindset, then they're going to act in the context of their training, or in that case, as a human being would when they're angry at somebody for doing something they didn't particularly like them doing. The difference here is these guys are functioning under the auspices of the law. So their behavior cannot necessarily entirely be, or at the very least, you can't give an excuse of these are just people. They have to be trained otherwise. A few points. As I said, this is somewhat of a Me Too movement for policing and the killing of a black man. There's no way this would have been prosecuted beforehand. Just so you can see what I mean, this is a video of what happened. Warning, the scene is graphic. It's not horribly graphic, but somebody is being shot, so take it as a warning. Violent scenes, be aware. All right, what you're seeing is Brooks fleeing, Rolfe chasing. Brooks turns and fires the phaser, or the taser, I keep saying phaser, I'm sorry, the taser. And Rolfe firing his weapon 3 times, shooting Brooks twice in the back, and another bullet going into an occupied vehicle. That is the strongest bit of of defense, or for people who say this is a clean kill and that there is no reason that this should be prosecuted. Now, and there are people who say it. This is right here. There's nothing malicious or sadistic in the way the officers behaved, he said. This is another sheriff. It's very unfortunate that the law enforcement leaders in the state of Georgia have not come out and stood together in this case. I think it's political and it's senseless. Yes, it is political. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. Both of those things can be at the same time, especially if you had a situation where these things were not being prosecuted before. The key point that I think is really interesting here is there's nothing malicious or sadistic in the way the officers behave. And that's, believe it or not, the sad part. These officers, and the part that may be uncomfortable, were trained to do exactly what they did. They are sacrificial lambs in this case. But just because they're sacrificial lambs, again, doesn't necessarily mean that they're innocent, nor does it mean they should be given a pass because other officers have been given a pass for bad, improper behavior. We must diminish the latitude by which maximum justice can be distributed. And herein lies the point. I'm showing this very specific video because I want you to see, turning around, phaser, I don't want to hide the ball, cop shoots. Now, what makes the state the state? Think about what I'm asking you. Ultimately, the thing that makes the law mandatory has nothing to do with morality, has nothing to do with what's right, has nothing to do with ethical, has nothing to even do with fairness or right treatment. Slavery, apartheid, hell, even genocide of Native Americans were all done under the auspices of the law. Now, what makes the law sovereign is the ability and the willingness to dispense force more prolifically than any other edifice in your society. The hands of the state regarding the enforcement of those laws are cops. We give the police immense power and latitude to dispense force, and ideally, with great power comes great responsibility. The rub here is, again, 99% of the killings from cops from 2013 to 2019 resulted in no charges. That doesn't even touch the abuses of authority short of dispensing maximum justice. What does this have to do, or what does this do to the psyche of a person? Again, think about what I am asking you. Does this incentivize or disincentivize excessive uses of force? I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6, is what one cop said when he was making the point of when he needs to use maximum justice. If there's any threat to my life at all, any perceived threat, I will put down the other person. Now, part of the premise behind prosecution of crime is to create a disincentive among the public so that everyone is clear that the vast powers of the state will not tolerate X or Y. 1,000 killings a year and 99% have no charges. The cop just walks. For comparison, the UK has something like 3 killings a year. Believe it or not, you may not think it, but I give police a window of latitude in regards to decisions on the use of deadly force. I'd argue it is necessary, as you have to be fair to them as human beings doing a difficult job, especially in situations where their life is potentially at risk and they need to make a split-second decision. But fundamentally, the police officers are paid by the state. The state funds itself through our taxes. It is not a sovereign currency. The U.S. government is a sovereign currency, but the states are not. They have to balance the budget each period, and they have no capacity to make dollars. They fund themselves through our tax revenue. We, as a society, expect for that money that we pay cops, even when dealing with someone who is not necessarily the best version of themselves, we still expect the cop to prioritize life, their own and the other person, within the context of their policing functions. This means rational actions are tethered around the preservation of life and should be taken into account with whether or not a killing is justified. Understand what I'm saying for the moment. I'm saying that when we're looking at whether a cop did something, we also needs to take into account whether there are rational actions that could have been taking place within the regard to the preservation of the life of the other person. You can't just use maximum justice and say, I was terrified for my life, if there were other rational actions that an individual could have taken that could have preserved that life. You don't get to just whack a person and then say you were terrified when you had other things that you could have done. You cannot credibly tell me, under that mindset, that this killing is justified. I will agree with you that fighting the cop is poor form. I would agree with you that taking the taser is utterly and entirely horrendous. I would even agree with you that firing that taser reaches a level of fuckery that is breathtaking. Agreed on all that. But going back to the point about rational options being available in the preservation of life, again, the cops and the person the cop is engaging, a few points can't be overlooked, especially if you're arguing that these events justify the ending of Rayshard Brooks' life. They had his driver's license. They had his car. They could have chased him down. It's basically a drunk that's running. The taser that he was firing had no capacity to kill or injure the officer, not to mention you had other officers that were around. If not chasing him down, you could have even let him go. He had his car and his license plate and his license. You could have literally went to his house and picked him up later. You could have given him a ticket and let him go on his way and let him walk home. You could have drove him to his house as opposed to arresting him. I'm making the point that there's all sorts of actions that he could have taken even after the fight, meaning even at the point at which they get into the fight and the guy runs. You could let him go. You could chase him down. You don't have to fire a gun. That's the point I'm getting at. Firing the gun was not necessary in this process. It just wasn't. His life wasn't at risk. You had other cops that were around him. The taser wasn't going to take him down. There was no justification for firing his weapon. That's the point I'm getting at. And more importantly, firing it in an open spot with a bunch of other people around. And it's testament to how dangerous that is. Breonna Taylor, but this bullet hit somebody else's car that was there. That could have been a baby. That could have been an older person. That could have been whatever. I'm just saying that bullet landed in somebody else's car, which means that bullet could have taken somebody else's life. He didn't have to fire the shots. You had other rational actions. Now, the reality of it is, the honest to God reality is that the police department is sacrificing him because they basically want to maintain some level of credibility. And the last thing they want to do is get the heat and the anger of the public for not charging him. The other cop is right. This is somewhat political. And it's sad that it has to be political. Because honestly, it's something that should have been done just as a routine course. We must diminish the latitude by which cops use deadly force. And part and parcel to diminishing that, if you're not necessarily going to deal with the poverty angle, is prosecutions. You make sure that there's accountability for those cop killings. And those cop killings, I would wager to you, will likely go down as they have a second thought about whether they want to dispense force. Again, I would argue to you that the uncomfortable reality of this is that cop did exactly what he was trained to do. A weapon was fired at him and he dispensed maximum justice. Fully justified, at least in his own mind, of what he did. I did my training. This is kind of what I'm getting at. The fact that he's a sacrificial lamb should not be passed over. Because if he is a sacrificial lamb, that means there are a lot of other wolves that are in that department that have basically looked at this and said, therefore, there but go the grace of God go I. I would wager the same thing with Chauvin, putting his knee on the man's neck. Therefore, but the grace of God go I. Because many of those officers know they've been in the exact same situations. They've done similar, the exact same things. And they were able to walk. Like, share, subscribe.